All right, good evening, everyone. I'd like to call to order the April 30th, 2015 meeting of the City of Bellingham Planning Commission and ask everyone to silence electronic devices, laptops, phones, anything that's going to make a noise, please mute it. And Heather, are we going to call the roll?
Phyllis McKee. Here. Tom Grinstead. Here. Garrett O'Brien.
Here.
Ali Taishi.
Here.
Steve Crooks.
Here.
Jeff Brown.
Here.
And Cerise Snow has been excused.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we would normally move into approval of our night's minutes, but we don't have any minutes to approve, so we'll move beyond that and go straight into the public comment period tonight. The public comment period is for anyone to talk about anything other than what's on tonight's agenda, which is a work session on the population growth projections for the comprehensive plan update. So if you want to talk about anything else, any topic, you would please come on down, 3 minutes, tell us what you think. Please state your name and address for the record. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Wendy Harris. I live in Bellingham, and there's a couple of things that concern me about the way this comp plan update is shaping that I wanted to voice. The first thing is we're moving forward without having done an EIS, an environmental impact statement. And when you're doing something of this magnitude, that's normally what's done. And the last time that the city went through its comp plan update, it did prepare an EIS. And the only thing that we're relying on now is the county EIS, and the only thing that the county is looking at is the UGA areas, and we don't even know what UGAs we may or may not be adopting. So it's kind of a concern, and you know this has important ramifications. The land that's left that we have in the city is really constrained by critical areas, and we really need to know about that and be mindful of that when we decide what kind of density and zoning we want to put in place. And so we don't have that information except for a few little pockets in the wetlands up north, but we don't have something overall. And one of the big glaring defects in the city's plan is with regards to a requirement to identify and protect habitat corridors. It's not only a requirement of the GMA, it's also in the city's critical area ordinance, and habitat corridors are actually classified as a critical area. So, what's really important when you're talking about habitat corridors is the ground cover, and we're not paying any attention to that in our growth patterns. And I really think it's a problem. I think it's a compliance issue, and we really need to be more mindful of these things, and I don't know how we can accomplish that without an EIS. The other thing that I'm concerned about is this piecemealing process that's going on. The GMA was intended to ensure there'd be sort of a comprehensive, cohesive planning effort that was coordinated. And instead of that, in the midst of us going through our comp plan update, the city is doing things like doing a lot of zoning, and it's working on a subdivision ordinance, and those things are specifically spelled out in the GMA as things that are covered under the Growth Management Act. The Growth Management Act includes updates to the comp plan chapters as well as development regulations, and it specifies those development regulations include the critical area ordinance, the zoning and subdivision ordinances. And so I'm really troubled that we have this separate track, and it does matter, and I'll tell you why.
We need about 30 seconds.
There are so many things going on right now, it's hard for citizens to keep track because they're not brought together. And additionally, under the comp plan, those things get pulled into a public participation plan, and that gives the public greater due process rights, a right to education, a right for more robust public process, and we're supposed to have that and we don't. So I hope that you'll consider these things and perhaps ask the staff about these matters. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Would anyone else like to make a comment during the public comment period? Okay, seeing no one, we'll end the public comment period and we'll move into our work session, which is the main event for tonight. And it looks like Greg's going to get us started. This is a work session on the population growth projection. Greg?
Sorry about that. Can someone get the lights, please? Thank you. Greg Ockett, Planning Department. Let me first introduce the staff that's here tonight. Director Rick Sepler is here, Lisa Poole and Chris Behe of our staff, and Moshe Quinn, and then Ted Carlson from the Public Works Department. That's everybody. I'll start the presentation tonight, and then I'll turn it over to Rick in just a few slides. He gets to talk about the good stuff. I get to talk about process. I'm not sure how that happened. Tonight we are having a work session. We're hoping that the commission at the end of the night is prepared to suggest one of the alternatives that we're going to present is the one that should be the subject of the public hearing, but we're not married to that. If you're not ready after tonight's meeting, we can meet again next week. We have a scheduled meeting next week. This would not be a public hearing. I think that given the interest in this process, when we laid out this schedule, I think we were surprised by the interest in this topic, and I think it would benefit us all to take a little more time. So what we'd like to suggest is next week's meeting, if you need it, would be a work session, not a hearing. We will hold a hearing in June. June 11th would be the preferred date, but we could do it on June 18th as well, just to give everybody more time to digest this issue. I know you're getting lots of comments. We're getting lots of comments. You'll hear lots of comments tonight. So it seems wise to take a little more time with this, and we're good with that. I think that's a good idea. So again, if at the end of the evening you believe that one of the alternatives that Rick is going to present is the one that should be the subject of the public hearing, that would be good. If you're not ready to do that yet, that's fine as well. We can work on that again next week. We do think that we do want to hear what you think about the alternatives that are presented either tonight or next week. And then a public hearing in June with proper notice and a staff report, and so that everybody's prepared adequately for that meeting. For tonight, again, Rick's going to present some alternatives that have been developed by staff. We've done that, and this is the starting point for our discussion, these alternatives. We've done some staff analysis on these, and we'll present that information to you tonight. We have listened to public input, and it is reflected in the alternatives. It does include some pros and cons of each of the alternatives, and some cost figures for you, some rough estimates of what the alternatives might cost. And again, no final recommendation tonight on an alternative if you're not prepared to do so. Any questions about process at this point? Okay? We're all good? Looks like we're all good. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Rick to talk about the alternatives.
Thank you. Members of the Commission, members of the community, we're going to talk about a couple of alternatives. These are more advanced than just straw men, in the sense that we have, with some rigor, reviewed them in terms of financial impact and also adequacy to meet some of the expressed goals. I think as a preface, we should talk about the role of developing alternatives. In processes such as these, the role of a planning department is to review the issue itself, ensure that you return to decision makers, both this body and the City Council, with a range of options that meet muster. The kind of muster it needs to meet is be legal, be implementable, and be within achieve the public interest. Now, that last one, there's no shortage of opinions in Bellingham of how to meet the public interest. And clearly tonight, through comment, it's very likely you hear a range of support for different alternatives. What we can say is the three alternatives we're presenting to you is not an exclusive universe. They could be mixed and matched. There are probably some others off the chart we didn't present that can be brought in. But from where we're at, our role is to find the best compromise between the various points of view that still passes that legal muster and moves forward. I'm going to ask Chris to pass out our summary, and I think it'll help folks as we go through the review. And we do have enough for folks who are here tonight. So I'm going to take time to go through each one. We'll talk about the relative merits. We'll talk about the genesis for each one itself. At the end, we will spend a few moments discussing items that were brought up that we didn't include and the reasons we did not include them, and then certainly be available for your questions. And I'll give it a moment or two till that can circulate through. So looking at urban growth area boundaries and looking at population projections, there are a couple of things we'd say we need to have true for virtually all of the alternatives. In essence, these are things that whatever your selection is, whatever your direction is to City Council, and ultimately through our process, things we have to look at. The first is incentives for urban villages. It is clear from the development patterns since 2006 and the focus of growth in the urban villages that it's a strategy that can work, but it is working unevenly, and we strongly recommend investing the time to see if we could speed up development in some of the urban villages that have been less successful, and ensure the ones that are under development are able to proceed with perhaps greater speed. So we don't believe that's a subsidy. We consider that a way of incentivizing an action that might occur a number of years from now to occur in a sooner period of time. And Council is starting to review that as soon as this Monday. We'll see some details on that. We also believe that it's imperative to look at level of service. Level of service is sort of the accelerator pedal, if you will, that's associated with growth. It deals with the causal need for services to be provided associated with development, and also to deal with those deficiencies we have now that we need to remedy as a community. We believe that there are 3 ongoing implementing projects. There's a big difference between the comprehensive plan itself and its implementing regulations. Comp plan by law is restricted to the times you can amend it to once a year. It's encouraged on schedule to have a review of both population as well as policy. However, there's no limitation on times nor sequence for implementing regulations. The encouragement is as long as your implementing regs are consistent with your adopted comp plan, they can be adopted at any time. We would like to say that we see the infill housing toolkit as being valuable. However, we see it where it's allowed by current zoning. We're not advocating it being spread in its usage at this time. Additionally, there are 2 works of the department. One is the accessory dwelling units. We have an ongoing update in progress as well as in subdivision, both where they're currently allowed by zoning. Candidly, in all 3 of these categories, we don't see significant growth in accommodating units at this time. So I'm going to work into the alternatives. This is Alternative A. It uses the mid-range population forecast. It stays within our current urban growth area boundary. It maintains South U Street in reserve. And let me take a second, since it's the first time we're mentioning a reserve. The Whatcom Comprehensive Plan, Whatcom County Comprehensive Plan, establishes a category for reserve. These are areas that are not ripe for inclusion in the UGA, but because of a variety of circumstances, anticipated need or characterization of urban services, are held in reserve for use that might be beyond the planning period. In essence, not saying it shouldn't be in the UGA, but it shouldn't be in the UGA at this time. Giving the reserve designation precludes inappropriate development patterns that at some day in the future, maybe beyond the planning period, beyond the 20-year planning period, when it is needed, it could be accommodated. It would be, in terms of costs, one can view our adopted capital facilities plan, because our adopted plan deals with, and our adopted water and streets plan deal with all the costs associated with dealing with this alternative. That's our operative alternative. However, we do believe it's necessary to revisit level of service, largely as a way to temper the balance between cost risen and associated with growth, ensuring that we recover what's necessary and also that it's appropriate for development. The pros of this would continue the urban village strategy, would allow for planned infrastructure improvements. There would be no upzones or expansion. We would be positioned well to respond to uncertainty. We feel fairly confident since we've done the detail in our transportation, water, sewer, and other plans. The cons is a question. Does this option support the goal of reducing growth in rural areas? And that's one of the things we need to make a finding on if we move forward with it. And will it provide additional single-family housing options? We'll move to alternative B of the three we're presenting. It's the mid-range forecast. It maintains the current urban growth area boundary. It maintains South U Street in reserve, but it does add the south half of the Kitech properties, that's Larrabee Springs properties, to urban growth area reserve. The notion on this is that, as you saw from analysis last week, we have limitations over the long-term horizon of where the community can expand. This does not predict that it would expand, but it preserves the option, both north and in South U Street. It would keep it in the reserve designation in the county. The city would have a review of potential development there, and no development would be permitted that would preclude expansion at some future date. Could be beyond the planning period, could be sooner, depending on what the actual growth numbers might be. The pros, similar to the first, continues the urban village strategy. Planned infrastructure improvements are known. There's no upzones. Again, we feel we're well positioned to respond to uncertainty. And the reserve status protects limited expansion options, perhaps even past the planning process into the future, since there are few choices available over the long term. The cons are we're not certain if this would help us with our single-family housing options that have been raised. There's no guarantee the reserve areas will be added to the urban growth area, and the reserve land does not count towards land supply or jobs. In essence, it's a placeholder as a reserve for long-term future use with no guarantee. Alternative C would look at expansion of the urban growth area to the north, and it's about 2/3 of the Kitech properties to the north. It would be between the mid and high range forecast. It would maintain South U Street in reserve, and as noted, would add the south half of the Kitech properties. The pros on this, it's the best opportunity to expand if additional land is determined necessary at the least cost to the city. It's the best option at this point for additional single-family housing, absent other interventions. The cons are our initial analysis of cost would be significant to the community. That's between $46 to $56 million over a 20-year horizon. The city absorbs the cost of new infrastructure and those pre-existing conditions. There are a number of conditions there that warrant that price tag. In essence, we develop below our level of service. Us going in, the additional development would pay for its direct improvements and its fair share of those. But new growth is not required by state law to pay for existing deficiencies, because in theory we all should have paid for that already. So that's where that cost comes up. We'd be concerned whether an affordable mix of housing options could be guaranteed, and we are questioning whether this further expansion represents community values. So a couple of key questions based on comments is, why didn't the staff recommend a low-range forecast? Low-range forecast would, again, you cannot shrink your existing city, but what it does allow is, if you do have overpopulation available within your city, the maintenance of UGA areas is challenged. And there is a risk we could lose some of our urban growth areas because we have more capacity than we need. A challenge on that is that much of it, remember, there's two tests for being in an urban growth area. One is characterization of urban services. It looks and feels like it should be in a city, it should be in a city. And the other is the need for expanded area to accommodate population. We would have to prove on point all of those arguments to sustain scrutiny. A challenge on low range too is that we would be in having to look at revising much of our infrastructure planning. It doesn't provide us the ability to be more flexible, should be higher or lower than we currently have now. It predicates us being lower and being at risk of overcapacity. Why didn't staff recommend additional infill? Clearly, we're focusing on the existing urban village strategy as a way of preserving the integrity and character of the neighborhoods. We see the upcoming subdivision ordinance revisions as a way of allowing density to be achieved, not bonus density, but density that's assumed in zoning, and giving a little bit of flexibility to achieve that. We see the accessory dwelling unit as being a potential for providing some small gains, and the numbers we're looking at for accessory dwelling units, we'd be surprised if we anticipated 200 units at some future date. It's not a significant number compared to the gross numbers that we're considering in citywide, but each little bit does help with the strategy. And upzoning, changing the character of neighborhoods, is not supported by existing regulatory context, nor by the neighborhoods themselves. Why didn't staff recommend further UGA expansions? Clearly, the issue for us is trying to balance the cost to the community, largely to address those existing deficiencies and the benefits and yield and units provided. While there could be expansion, the expansion would not yield affordable homes, may yield very expensive homes, and that may not achieve our policy ends. The Lake Whatcom watershed, as noted in the analysis last week, significant concerns about water quality, and it is a significant limit, and it's in our best interest to protect it. The presence of critical areas or environmentally impacted areas, those do further limit our expansion and choice. Topography and existing development patterns. I'll recall the slide that showed successively all of the locations and limitations, and there are limited options that are available for us. Some might ask why the South U Street was not included. Preliminary assessment of costs show a range of 47 to 74 million to the community over a 20-year horizon to bring it in, and it would provide half the capacity of South Kitech, the northerly addition. Does not mean that South U Street should never come into the city. It just means that at this time we think it may not be ripe for addition to the city itself. And I think I'll close, and we'll answer, my colleagues and I will answer any questions you have. This was the last slide we showed you last week, just to recall the limitations that were present in terms of expansion and the two areas that we considered having survived that initial muster for potential expansion. We'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. After the commission is done, and if you wish to take public comment, we'd like to ask the opportunity tonight to respond to some of the comment as we hear it. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Rick. So, we want to start, Steve?
Start it off.
All right.
First question, based on a public comment tonight, Director, why is there not an EIS associated with these three alternatives?
EISs and environmental impact statements are used to establish an environmental record. The environmental record is comprised of all prior analysis, and that analysis is cumulative. When an action is identified after you conclude, you assess whether you need to do additional review. Two of the alternatives before you tonight would be identical to those considered in 2008, and that EIS could be adopted. Supplemental review may be required should you opt for another alternative that would consider expansion if that wasn't done. So in essence, we have not made an environmental determination at this time. We're looking at the options that are being considered. When direction is provided, we can consider what the most appropriate route would be. We don't dispute that an environmental impact statement provides good information, but one can use the assemblage of all of the prior work and studies and assess whether after a checklist is completed you need to do a determination of significance or not. What I can say is the changes that were considered in framing this process did not consider significant changes to our urban growth area or population, and largely did not include it at the beginning. Should that have been different, if it was considered a significant expansion, new areas that weren't previously reviewed, new issues beyond what we had previously considered, that might have been a different story.
Follow-up question. Other than the community that's present tonight, the Planning Commission, and those watching over Channel 10, how are we going to disseminate the 3 alternatives to the public to get comment on either of these alternatives?
The alternatives before you in terms of UGA, clearly once you identify a recommendation, I imagine we'll have no shortage of comment on it. There are strong opinions. We have conducted a process to date which has included survey, public meetings, outreach, individual meetings. We have used a variety of technologies. There's no proposal yet out there. We don't have a proposal that we should shop. You craft the start of that process by recommending to the council and council adopting the urban growth boundary and population. Then we enter into a fairly deep planning process. There will be ample opportunities this summer for public workshops, open houses. We talked about some open dialogues so we could be less formal about some of the issues. But it all starts by framing the issue. So we're sort of at the beginning of the journey, and we intend to broaden involvement.
Thank you.
Jeff?
So I have 2 questions that are linked. Are we going to do round robin, 1 question at a time, or do you want the linked questions?
If they're linked, I don't have a problem with you asking them both.
Okay. I'll try to be brief.
Lots of time.
Well, my first question is, one of the dimensions that we haven't really talked about is what kind of population are we going to grow? And I guess one of my issues that I struggle with is, on the one hand, I read about how Bellingham's a new retirement community and people want to move here and buy $300,000 plus single-family residences to retire in Bellingham. And the other thing that could be the growth factor is workforce housing. And they're 2 different markets to me. You know, the kind of retirement homes that are at single-family retirement homes that are at the higher end are very different than what you might have as the affordable housing. And that's actually, first off, its question is, was there any attempt to determine exactly what kind of growth demographic we were looking at and to respond with some analysis of the housing types that they might actually be seeking?
I'm assuming you're talking about the not just the areas we're highlighting on the map, but the entire amount of growth that we're looking at both in the city, in the current unincorporated urban growth area, and what might end up in either one of these 2 areas we're looking at on the map.
Well, I'm looking at if you have 25K additional people that are going to require housing, what mix is that of people that are additional people in the entire city that you're going to try to absorb, and what kind of housing are they looking for?
I would, and I can look in here at the exact mix, but what we've leaned on is the comprehensive plan work we did in the previous iteration. So the housing chapter in the 2006 comprehensive plan addressed the variety of needs in the community, and again, basically indicated, like from some of the testimony that you heard here a week ago, that we do need to represent the people that can have, that make 80% or less of the median income, and have a variety of not just multifamily housing forms, but single-family housing forms. And so since that time, that's been the focus of a lot of the work that's been done in the urban villages, the focus of the work that was done with the infill housing toolkit. So there's, again, a variety of things like that. The zoning code itself that we operate under does not prescribe specific housing values or forms to that level of detail. It gives you a density figure and, the mechanics of setbacks and those kinds of things, but it doesn't prescribe a type of house specifically.
Okay, well, my second part of the question, which may be more interesting or may not, is that I noticed on your pros and cons, affordable housing only came up once, but single family seemed to be there a few times. And I guess the issue I see is that the issue of infill and upzoning was taken more or less off the table in the explanation. However, if I sit back and I think about it, and I think about what the most likely scenario is for affordable housing that's market-based, that's not subsidized. It comes in having different housing types, having smaller footprints, having places located close to existing parks and infrastructure, so you're not having to develop new parks out on other ends of town and out in the fringes. And that puts you in an entirely different place. And it seems like that affordable housing, particularly equity affordable housing, has been taken off the table here. And we're talking more about, you know, okay, you have a generic additional household count, and, you know, what's the impact on single family? And I'd like to see more impact on what it's going to take to provide affordable housing, and if that's location-based, if that's size-based, housing type-based, and how many of those 30,000 people are going to be looking for affordable housing versus higher-end retirement housing.
A couple of things. Our operative comprehensive plan focuses a great deal on trying to provide affordability and focuses a great deal on trying to find infill as a means of doing it. You know, infill, in many ways, we have no problem with theoretical agreement. All agree that it's the most economical way to develop, the most sustainable, the least extension of services, we're able to provide most economically and keep prices down. However, the implementation of infill in communities depends on it being ripe. And what we're seeing at this point in time is it may not be ripe yet for a lot of the community, a lot of the neighborhoods. However, it's not a static environment, and circumstances change. And we need to be responsive for that and have the suite of tools available when those circumstances change, and it's warranted.
Well, I'll be eagerly watching that, because you know, at the risk of being unpopular, you know, I don't like to see generational warfare, essentially, where people have their single-family house, they're sitting pretty, and then basically everybody else that's in the city is cut out because there aren't, say, $150,000 or $125,000 equity opportunities for people to start climbing the rung of homeownership. And I can see that as a real possibility here, and I hope that doesn't happen more than it already has.
Garrett?
Yeah, my biggest question is, we're looking at, you know, what to do with the urban growth areas. There's, you know, two of the areas. One is adding, you know, the area to the north into the UGA, primarily because there's an anticipated need for single-family housing. Do we have numbers on how many single-family homes we're projecting to have built over the next 20 years and how that relates to our historical background?
Not sure why we're not getting them in there. Can you guys see that? Is that okay? There's a lot of information here, but I'll just kind of run through what I think you're asking for, Garrett, and then you can direct me as you have additional questions. So the top of the table here, this is all our current land capacity. So this is the what we think, based on the land capacity model that we've run in 2013 and then tweaked a little bit since then. The top line here is what we think we can accommodate in all of the urban villages except the waterfront. We've got the waterfront on a second line because there are some different assumptions for that. The waterfront's right here. All other areas inside the city limits, so this is the kind of incremental infill on individual vacant lots within neighborhoods or around the edges of the city and the neighborhoods that have kind of green fields around the edges, future subdivision activity and development in those areas. And then at the bottom of the table here, we have the unincorporated urban growth area. So that's just give you a sense of what's going on there. These are the total housing unit totals that we think we can achieve in those areas based on existing zoning densities within between now and 2036. This is the split out of that for single family, and here's the multifamily units. And then when we get to applying the figuring out how many people we think we can accommodate in those, we have the next couple of lines are the single family vacancy rate, the multifamily vacancy rate, and then the persons per occupied housing unit that we're applying, and then the population in each of those and the overall aggregate population. So just so you can see how the table works there. So what we have is about 1/3 of the future housing units that we anticipate being built between now and 2036 would be single-family in form, and about 2/3 would be multifamily. And then you can kind of see what proportion is landing in urban villages, in other neighborhoods throughout the city, or in the unincorporated urban growth area. So does that kind of get at what you were looking for there?
Yeah, a question on the unincorporated urban growth area. So you get 1,200 homes projected in those areas. Is that realistic considering that the city doesn't extend services into the UGA?
So this is, so 1,224 single-family and 333 multifamily units for just under 1,560 units. The assumption is that over that 20-year period, we would be annexing, as we have in the last 10-year period, significant pieces of those. And as we annex, utilities get extended. There are a few areas where there are already utility service agreements in place, and a lot of those have developed, as you've seen over the past number of years. But the assumption is that they will get utilities as they are annexed and be served and then develop at whatever density the zoning prescribes.
Chris, is that our current UGA?
This is our existing, exactly, this is our current UGA, of which right now, of the area in that unincorporated growth area, there are currently 3 annexation proposals that are in process of being considered.
So how do those numbers compare to, say, the previous 20 years? So if you say single-family homes, 4,000, 5,200 homes projected for the next 20 years, how does that compare to the last 20 years?
So at the bottom of the smaller table here, what we have is the single-family housing units and multifamily, and then the percent multifamily in total for 1980, 90, all the way through to current year 2014. And then what we, again, if we took all of the growth up here and added it to what we have in 2014, that's what we would end up with in 2036. So you can see we've gone from 21,400 to about 41,300 in the entire, this is counting the city and the unincorporated urban growth area as far as housing units. And then what we would, if by 2036 we do achieve this amount of growth and all of those housing units do get built, we'd be at about 58,500 housing units. And you can see the percentage of multifamily housing changing over time. You can see in 1980, we were at about 32, just under 33% multifamily in the entire, the city and the urban growth area. We're currently at about 44% multifamily housing, and that would change to about 51% if we were to absorb the growth that we're anticipating.
So from 1980 to 2000, that 20-year period, there was about 5,000 homes that were built.
5,000 single family, if you're looking at the overall.
Right.
So single family homes.
The new projected numbers really aren't a significant departure from the previous 20 years. The caveat to that is that there's significantly more people now. There's a much higher population. So that's where you get the percentage, the change in the percentage of single family home ownership.
I'd say that's a fair assessment, yeah.
That answers my questions for that, so.
Okay.
Phyllis?
I was just curious as to why, looking at bringing in on the urban growth, just half of the KITAC property and not looking at all of it. Is that because of the way the land is laid or something else significant?
Primarily, the reason that we didn't recommend going all the way up to the northern end of the KITAC property at Smith Road is because there is an existing area it's a LAMRD, a local area of more intense rural development. So there's a LAMRD that Whatcom County has established that is adjacent to the north boundary of the KITAC property. And the county actually has a hearings board decision that says you can't have a UGA immediately adjacent to a LAMRD. So there's some question about legally whether we could go all the way up to Smith Road. And so at this point, at least, given what we know now, that's why we've only recommended sort of the southern two-thirds of the property.
Thank you.
Tom?
So how close could you get to Smith Road? Like 1 foot away?
Well, yeah, I don't know, Tom. I think there's some question about the legality of it, and when we're prepared to go there at this point.
Can we go to war with the county?
We could, sure.
I have a stupid Norwegian question for you. You presented 3 alternatives and very cleverly have not stated on that sheet which one is the preferred alternative.
We offered a range to you that we can, we believe, fall within the bookends. There are merits for each approach, and we can support them. Internally, we believe we've looked at A and B as being practicable at this point, but again, we can support all 3.
So, yeah. So I get 2 out of 3 are, quote, preferred, unquote.
A lot has to, if a lot is dependent on how you wish to proceed. And if you are interested in mining down on the data in terms of cost, for example, if that's determined for you, we can do that. That affects us. Our concern is not, it's the significant cost to the community that weighs heavily on alternative C and also for South U Street. And again, it's an issue where it's just not, it does not appear ripe at this time for the units achieved for the cost that's needed.
Okay.
I got a quick follow-on question on that. Following on that, I guess, there's 3 options being presented. 2 of them have no actual increase in our population absorption, right? I mean, 2 of these, A and B, basically hold the mid-range, our current projection. And the 3rd one includes south half of Kitech, which is 840 housing units. And since we, a year ago, recommended that the high option be taken, we've kind of been working from that concept, taking public comment on that, talking about that, and none of these alternatives contemplate us absorbing the high. It was 1,700, right? So this is about the highest you've recommended is going half of what the high would be. So is that because the planning department believes that that is not attainable or achievable or is a bad idea at this stage after the review that we've done?
You can make the choice and recommend to the council high. Council can choose high. Planning department does not recommend the high allocation for the reasons stated. We believe that it's a cost issue, a level of service issue, and a need issue. And when you look at those 3 alternatives, we were trying to find a suite that reflected the interest that was expressed for some expansion. That's C. Try to say that the existing boundaries and existing planning is adequate. That's A. And looking at B, saying if we're wrong about some of the choices we have, B provides a reserve that allows us to be more nimble in the future if we've guessed wrong and we were too conservative. So, I mean, that's the thinking. And I can say, I guess, Tom, to your question is we don't recommend the high. We recommend the medium as practicable for the reasons stated.
Thank you. Garrett? Phyllis?
Just a question on the cost. You talk about, the new development has impact fees. It basically pays for the cost of the development, the hard cost. And a lot of these costs, if I'm understanding correctly, are what you call deficiencies. Can you explain a little more on what those costs are and how you arrived at those numbers?
Well, a couple of things. First, I'm sure you'll hear, we do not assess the full development impact. In essence, we assess a portion of our impact fee. That's a decision that's been made in many communities to try to not stifle development, to acknowledge that some folks who came earlier paid none into it, though they've been paying rates over time. but we don't recover 100% of our actual costs through impact fees. That's a negotiated issue and separate. What I can say is development pays two ways. They do it by providing improvements. That's typically like frontage improvements. You're doing your sidewalk, the curb, the gutter, the storm, the sewer in front. That serves your development. But they also contribute to off-site impacts they have. For example, downstream impacts or existing road conditions, because they add trips that go down that road. State law is very clear. We can assess, and we do, a fair share contribution based on those impacts. So if a new development up here affected a roadway and it was assessed that they were 5% of the problem, we would collect those dollars, in addition to the impact fees for when the homes come in and requiring the improvements. The challenge is the other 95%, that existing deficiency that's there. The public pays for that. So we are playing catch up because we didn't contribute adequately to that. And the city assumes that balance. The rub on this is that 5% isn't enough to do the project to remedy the issue. And it needs to be spent, and we need to find monies in the public center. We scramble to try to do that. That's where most of those deficiencies are. I know that our Public Works Director is here and can enumerate more clearly on some examples of how that mathematics work.
Does it take into account any of the increased revenue?
Yes.
Property tax?
We can, in preparing the preliminary estimates, we didn't send the spreadsheets, but we look at all of the revenue that's received from property tax. Some will assert that residential pays for its costs. That's not been true in my experience. Commercial more than pays for its costs, actually provides revenue that offsets it. But residential, oftentimes, because of these existing issues, don't fully cover it. Again, there's direct costs and the costs over time. We looked over 20 years. Should you proceed with one of the options that looks for expansion, we would give you the cost breakdown as part of your decision making.
Thank you.
Phyllis, can you have a comment?
Yes, I was getting to the cost issue as well, this 46 to 56 million over 20 years, and we talk about making corrective moves along the line or along the way. As regardless of which one of these choices, I presume that they're all going to be adjusted from time to time with a course correction. Is that correct?
As I understand it, you're asking is, do those prices change?
Well, I was just cloaking the question, and it seems like any choice we make is a projected choice and a goal. And then as we see whether we're coming close to it or missing it entirely, we make adjustments along the way. Is it?
That's correct.
Okay.
We are adaptive when we look at the numbers as
Correct.
they come in. We see the trends that are emerging, and we try to do it because we're just forecasting the future.
Sure. So when the high cost is listed here for alternative number or letter C, which is between the mid and the high range, and we suggested the high range before, at what point would we be incurring the actual expense of this 46 to 56 million? I presume it wouldn't be evenly distributed over the 20 years, but there would be some triggers that would cause this to come on board. Is that right?
It's a good point. Some of the issues can be deferred over time. You reach a point where you get to the level of service. Remember, that's sort of that accelerator on growth that you aren't able to keep up, and you have to make the remedy. However, some costs are immediate. When you have a deficiency for emergency services, that comes online, and it's not something you could phase in over time. This is the challenge. The challenge is you can't build half a station. So you need to build a full station, and you can't staff it half the time. You have to staff it full time. And that's where we have those big bumps that can't be distributed over time, so they absorb more easily.
So just carrying that forward, though, so alternative C would trigger some of these expenses to be immediate then?
Alternative C is better in contrasting U Street with the northerly Kitech property. Alternative C is more gradual, and should you wish to proceed on that, we can give you a breakdown over time that would show it. And you could see when the costs are occurred. What I can say is things do change. We do provide services, for example, in South U Street and the U Street area. If we need, for other means, to have to go in and remedy those services for current customers in the area, utility customers, that may lessen the cost because we might have to do it as part of a municipal improvement. We're discussing that today. Sometimes these numbers change because we have to take action just for the folks who are there.
Jeff, and then Steve.
I'm going to re-ask the question I asked last time, but slightly differently. Last session, not today. And that was one of the solutions for this issue seems to be phasing it in and having not as a reserve area that's outside your planning period, but have it a reserve area for the second half of your planning period, perhaps with triggers that need to be met. And what I would think is that the downside of including something in your UGA up front in the comp plan on a 20-year horizon is it could come in the third year, or it could come in the fifth year, or the eighth year, or the 12th year. You don't know. It kind of depends when the vote is and what council does. And that doesn't give you a lot to go on in terms of looking at the financial impacts and looking at the perceived need to supplement the city's inventory. And so what I'm kind of wondering is if it's ever been done or if it's even an option to have a conditional inclusion in the UGA that say in the 10th year of the plan, which is when you're actually doing the next plan, but in the 10th year of the planning period, you evaluate, and if certain triggers have been met, it can be part of your UGA, and therefore, since it's in there, you can include it as part of your land supply for this 20-year planning cycle, not as a next planning cycle UGA. I'm just kind of curious if there's a way to hold something like, poker, just kind of hold it back a little bit, but have identifiable triggers for when it comes on the table.
And I think our attempt of putting it in reserve in alternative B was to do just that.
So that's outside the 20-year planning period then.
But it could be accelerated. You could develop a policy base, which would, as part of your annualized reviews, your 6-year reviews, you could check for warrants, whether it should be changed in circumstances. You certainly can do that. Okay. That's not uncommon. Okay. And the purpose of the reserve is, from where we sit now, it doesn't seem like we'll need it in 20 years, but things change. Mm-hmm. If certain conditions change, you could have a policy base that would reconsider that at the appropriate time.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out if who knows where this is going to go, but if alternative A or B were chosen, there still seems to be some utility to having an orderly time frame down on paper for when that next stage will be done, both for the ownership of the property and for the city to know that that's next up, essentially in a planning area, and start to do the capital planning you would need for the improvements to pull things online. So it doesn't necessarily exclude it outright during this planning period, but it also doesn't necessarily include it, but it's still part of the land supply. Or is that being a little bit subversive? I don't know. But anyway, that was just a thought.
Well, I have a thought on that, but I'll wait till Steve's done.
Yeah, in looking at the pros on alternative C, it says provides the best opportunity to expand at least cost to the city. Why isn't that valid for alternative B in the pros?
No expansions proposed at that point. It's just putting something in reserve, doesn't count towards our numbers. It's preserving options for long into the future or if circumstances change. And for Commissioner Brown, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to I was asking if we had urban growth area section. Some comprehensive plans have a chapter called urban growth area that provide those guidance on when they should be brought in and conditions. And that was my distraction. I was asking if we had that. I was informed it's within our land use. So there is a location to put that. I'm sorry.
Okay. The next question, and the cons for alternative C, high cost, 46 to 56 million over 20 years. If in fact the Kitech area is added, changes from a reserve to the UGA, wouldn't it isn't it a valid fact that that 46 to 50 million then goes over to the con side for alternative B?
Well, if it's added as just reserve, there's no cost to us. We're not going to serve it. It's not going to develop.
But if in fact we did have, let's say.
Yes, it would. And you'd
So-
have to say, what are the changed circumstances that would warrant it? Has additional development occurred to the north that reduced some of those deficiencies, that reduced the cost? Have we found a different method through annexation that helps dealing with pre-existing deficiencies? Things like that are proposed every year in Olympia. None survived this year. But there might be changed circumstances that could say it's not as great when you bring it in. But certainly cost is always going to be a factor when you expand your urban growth area. We do that now for annexations.
I'd like to follow on Jeff's train of thought briefly, if I can, and ask a couple questions. When an area is in our UGA, we have to plan for it in our capital facilities plan. Is that accurate? We have to plan for those costs that are going to be coming. And when it's in a reserve, we don't, or we do not plan for those costs.
We don't directly plan for the costs, but we know when it's in a reserve designation that that's the first place that we're going to look for additional land if it's determined that we need it. So we can always keep in mind that those areas may at some point be developed to urban density. So as we're planning utilities and other things, we can be mindful of that. The reserve designation really says this is where you look first if you decide you need additional land.
So
it does help with our planning. We don't have to plan for the costs in our capital facilities plan, but we're aware that it's possible that an area might come in, and we keep that in mind as we're planning things in the area, for sure.
So when it's in, we actually start saving money effectively, looking for ways to get the money to build the roads that are going to be required to be put there and things like that.
Yes.
That all goes into that 20-year window.
Yes.
So I guess I just have a comment to follow up what Jeff said. I feel like the reserve is something that we don't plan for. It's like putting it off to the side so we can ignore it a little bit. And it seems like if it would be wiser to bring it into the UGA, and then we actually have to think about those costs. If we leave it in the reserve, then we're being reactive to a certain degree if we all of a sudden need it. Because we just spent 15 years not planning for the cost of that absorption. And with that, I have another question, which is the cost of these deficiencies. These are things like roads and utilities that aren't there, and fire and police service. And in my mind, those costs go up over time. There's no going down. Roads are going to get more expensive. And Ted, maybe you could confirm that, but roads, water, and sewer are probably going to get more expensive. Fire services will get more expensive. Wages will go up. So if we wait, isn't it true that those areas we put in reserve will just get more and more and more costly over time to annex, to ultimately bring in? Like, if we wait 10 years, when you guys come back, it's going to be 100 million, not 50 million. Is that a fair generalization to make?
Well, I think costs do increase over time. That's fair to say. Whether our need is present for that area or not is the issue at hand. And we have suggested that we could accommodate our reasoned growth within the existing urban growth area.
Rick, you gave us two reasons that we have to think about this. One was need, and one was urban characterization. And this really strikes at U Street a little bit for me, which is that we have a high level of urbanization and existing service out there that we allowed to be built as a city some time ago. And so that's another reason. You've actually said that to us several times. That's another reason. So in the context of U Street, when we look at that criteria, and we look at the potential just continued increasing cost of ultimately dealing with that, which it sounds like we're supposed to deal with, how do we reconcile that? Because it sounds like one day we're going to have to face the music that we've got urban development outside of our city limits, and we're going to have to deal with it, unless that's something we can just put off forever. I guess just like thoughts on that.
No, we concur. U Street should be part of the city. It's characterized by urban growth. It has our services. Whether this, at this point, looking back, and saying, gosh, should we have done that? Should we have allowed it to occur? Hindsight's 20/20.
Sure.
We're faced with a difficult issue, but we're not alone. It's like the Geneva area. Clearly, there are 85 or 50 units that are available to be built there. It's characterized by our services. Should be part of the city. It's a ripeness test, and that would be our response. We just don't have the devices yet to bring that in. The challenge is we can't saddle the newest homes to cover all the existing deficiencies. We are somewhat responsible for the circumstance we created as a community, but we need some help to figure out a way to equitably fund the infrastructure we need. Otherwise, it's disproportionate to the benefit we get. And again, we're looking like every other city with similar circumstance for some regulatory fix. Whether that will come or not, I can't predict. I do know it's an issue that's constantly brought up at the start of every session.
That makes sense to me. My concern is, I guess, that if we leave it in the reserve, we won't go find that solution to mitigate the cost. And if we put it in the UGA, then we're forced to face that issue and try and find a solution. And hey, we can always take it out, which is what we did with U Street after it was in the UGA for a long time. And so I guess, not to pick on that particular issue, but I'm thinking about those kinds of things too, and I think it maybe isn't exactly what Jeff's concerned about, but I'd like to think about we have a mechanism to not bring it in and incur that cost right away, which is the city council choosing not to annex it, which they do. And I've seen with some of these other annexations where they condition an annexation on a method to pay for some of the costs. So it's just a thing that I think we should pay some attention to as we go through this deliberation. And that's, I guess I'll get off my soapbox for now. So, anyone else? Garrett?
Well, I think that brings up an interesting point about, obviously what we're talking about is the urban growth area. It doesn't mean that it's going to be, brought into the city limits. So services aren't extended into the UGA currently, so essentially the character of that area wouldn't change. As far as annexation goes, can you maybe give us a brief rundown of what that process looks like and how one would go about annexing property? And
Sure. So annexation is generally done by a petition from the property owners. So they petition the city for annexation. The city council at the beginning of the process makes a determination whether or not they even want to consider this. If they decide they want to consider it, and we have 3 of those right now that are under consideration, the applicants need to get at least the signatures of at least 60% of the property owners, or property owners that own 60% of the assessed value of the area. So that's that. Once they do that, then it comes back to council, and there are some steps in between, but generally then it comes back to council for a final decision. So it's initiated by the property owners. They have to get a certain percentage of the affected property owners to sign the petition, and the council makes the final decision after a public hearing. It takes about 9 months or a year to work through the entire process. The Boundary Review Board is involved too, but those are the highlights of the process.
Thanks. Thank you.
Phyllis, did you?
Well, I seem to recall that the last meeting, there was some discussion about a developer who was interested in doing something with some of the other undeveloped area on the U Street. Am I correct in that or not?
Yes.
And so would we be bringing in what would allow that development to occur if we were to take in make it part of the UGA and move it into the city as opposed to keeping it in reserve? Would it open up doors for that developer to be able to create that development then?
Yes.
Okay. Is that a bad thing? I mean,
again, we need to look at the costs associated, the costs that the city would incur. But yeah,
Okay.
if it were put into actual UGA, then they could petition for annexation. The city council would review it, look at the costs, look at the benefits, and decide whether or not it was appropriate to annex the area. Then if it gets annexed, then it becomes eligible for urban services and urban development.
Jeff, sorry.
Well, I have to admit the continuing heartburn I have over this is that, given the market right now, given interest rates, given the demand for single family, people moving to Bellingham for various reasons, I don't doubt that if these areas are in the UGA, somebody would try to pull them in the next 2 years and build housing as fast as possible. crank it up because the market's here. What the interaction of that is with the overall planning picture and how we're trying to perhaps preserve wildlife corridors, perhaps take other values into consideration, affordable housing, as I mentioned before, getting density where we have existing infrastructure, all that goes out the window. And the taxpayers pay more to boot, the existing taxpayers. And I just see a fundamental disconnect here that makes me very conflicted, because there's a demand for it. Somebody can make money doing it. It can get pulled into the city. But I don't know that it's unmitigated good, because there are tax implications to it, and it basically torpedoes other objectives we might have in the planning period. And so that's not really a question. That's a comment of that whole nexus between planning in a vacuum, or planning at the best we can over 20 years, versus what's actually going to happen under market circumstances. And I'm a little bit uncomfortable with that.
Are you concerned that we wouldn't be able to arrest that annexation from occurring, and we would be kind of caught out on those costs even worse than what would happen if it planned out over 20 years?
Well, it's council's decision. You know, obviously that would go before them, but I think we have some more pressing concerns that will come out of the comp plan process. You know, affordable housing, not to sound like a broken record, but, you know, what is in there that is actually responsive to people that want different housing types, that don't have as much money, versus going out and putting up $300,000 houses on the fringes of the city. And to me, that's the nexus of those two issues, is the fundamental planning issue I think the community is facing. So I'm just uncomfortable here, because once something is in the UGA, in some respects, you lose control over the timing of when you want to pull property in, what phase development makes sense, because it's all going to depend on the proposal that's made to the city council, and where the city council says pull it in, and then the rest of us bear the consequences. So that's all.
I have a question. I have a question for Chris. We've been talking about the last slide you had up with the percentage of multifamily and single family that Garrett asked about. 67% would be the growth of those over the period to get us to like the 50-50 mix, basically. How would South Kitech come in and change that? Do you know how that would change that? Because that would predominantly be single family, I'm assuming.
I can't say exactly what the mix would be, because we've seen a development concept. Obviously, that it's no permits have been applied for. The area is still in rural zoning status at this point, so it's all very conceptual. But it was a mix of housing styles with a small component of multifamily, but about 85% of it were in single-family forms. Okay. So, and a total of, for that south half, which is kind of the way that the property owner has it phased out at this point, there's really only kind of one beginning phase that they've shown us, and the other two are more conceptual at this point, but they do have numbers for them. The area that we would look at adding in that south half totals around 800 housing units.
So it wouldn't dramatically alter those percentages, probably, because you'd only be adding.
It would maybe a percentage point for the overall, like the 2036 citywide picture. It would be, it would increase the availability or the mix of single-family housing, but it's an incremental increase.
Thank you. All right. So, no other questions or comments this time. We could take a quick break and then take some public comment. And then I think we need to get back to some of our discussion after that and talk about some of these bigger picture ideas that Jeff raised and other things. So why don't we take a 10-minute break? It's 10 after, so at 20 after, we'll start up again. Thank you. And we'll take public comment at that stage. Okay, thank you, everybody. We'll just wait 1 minute for people to grab their seats. Okay, so we're going to take some public comment at this time. And there's no one who signed up on the list. I'm sure that's not accurate, though. So I guess we'll just, whoever wants to start us off can come down and we line up against the wall, and name and address, please. And please limit your comments to 3 minutes tonight, and I'll try and give you a heads up at the 30-second point. Thank you.
Maybe this one, I don't know. Cal Leenstra, Bellingham, State Street, Fairhaven, actually. I'm just flabbergasted. I'm going to put something on the projector here with Craig's help, which is about 100 acres that we are partners in South U Street. And when the image comes up, you'll see that, where is it? Now, there's an urban area right there. All the stuff in the black, our property is in there. And the school's on the east side of that black boundary, multi-million-dollar new school that was located there because that's where they told the growth would be occurring. The site committee was told that specifically. We have letters to that effect. On the south there's South Hills, that one on your right-hand side there. That's a fully developed upwards of 100-lot subdivision, about 3 or 4 per acre. And another one there is Wildflower, which is 40 or 50, fully developed. There's Sammy's Highlands, which we developed there on the left side, which is arguably the finest residential community in Bellingham. I say that being highly prejudiced as I am. We're bordered by city parks. There's 2 city parks there. City of Bellingham on the left says 2 areas. Then, of course, the nicest park in the county, Lake Padden, is just a half mile or a quarter mile to the south. Lake Padden and the golf course. All those areas in South Hill are served by city water and city sewer. City water and city sewers to the north of us, city water and city sewers to the east of us. We're bounded on all but I think one side with the city limits. That is an area not suitable for farming, unlike the Wilder Ranch, what I worked on when I was a kid in high school, made hay there and picked up sticks behind the bulldozer. That was the most beautiful ranch in all of Whatcom County. This, on the other hand, is a little bit of slope, like a great vineyard. It's not suitable for farming. It's not in the Lake Whatcom watershed. It's got utilities all around it. It's served by the bus line. There's a fire station there, which is not doing an adequate job of serving the existing customers. The water tank that services Wade King School, you should take a look at it. It's pretty small. If that school ever started on fire, you have to wonder if there's enough water there to save it. If this area was developed, there'd be about a 2 million gallon water tank put in there, which we at one time agreed to do at our expense and get it on a latecomers agreement on the payback. So this is really hard to understand. We've had a plat approved here in the past, and the economy took a turn, so we didn't do it. But this property was approved. All the engineering a lot of the engineering has been done. This is master planned here by Jones, and there's just no reason that this should not be a 3 or 4 unit per acre subdivision. I mean, it's just absolutely unbelievable, and that this is natural for future development. We want a development. We've got finances to do it. We've got utilities in that area. So now is the time to include that in the UGA and annex it to the city and develop some homes that people can afford. Thank you.
Thank you, Cal.
I'm okay, thanks, Chris. Hi, my name is Darcy Jones with Jones Engineers, 4164 Meridian Street. I'm here on behalf of the Kitech Corporation. They own the property at the north end of town that's being considered for UGA inclusion under Alternative C. I think I want to respond, or at least help on a couple of the questions that came out. We have done several different types of site planning, and the type of density that we can accomplish, the type of housing product can be flexible depending on what the city needs. I think we definitely would focus on affordable single-family homes. We've Kitech has actually been building a lot of affordable single-family homes in the north end of Bellingham for quite some time. As a matter of fact, the last 3 years, they've been the county and city's top builder with, I think, average of about 3 homes per month for the last 3 years. They've been building and selling. They use local contractors, local suppliers, and they're selling the houses, I think, primarily because of the price point they're at. And Mr. Sepler, your staff published, I think a couple weeks ago, a memo about what relative affordability is, and I think it was if someone spent 30% of their household medium income, then it would be relatively affordable. Well, and the medium income being $62,000 a year in Bellingham. So I backed that math out. I said, okay, if someone had 10% down on a $275,000 house, their mortgage would end up being about, at 4.5%, about principal and interest, $1,250 a month, taxes $250 a month, insurance $50 a month. Well, that's $1,550 a month. If you take 30% of $62,000, that's $1,550 a month as well, if you back that math up. So generally, we're in that 270, 275 range for affordable under that criteria, I believe. And I'd like to give you some statistics, because last year, the average sale price for Kitech's homes that they've been building and selling, again, 37 of them last year, the number one builder, $275,000. So they've been hitting that number really good, just going by that general criteria in that memo you wrote a few weeks ago. So I wanted to point that out to you. I also wanted to mention well, let's see. I think I'll leave it at that. I think you could say if you're looking at 60-30 or 75-25 mix, if you change that mix, regardless of your population range you're at, the mix, changing that mix would significantly change your land capacity analysis. And the results of all of this would be significantly different just by adjusting the expected mix, because, multifamily takes up a lot less land than single family. So if, you're looking at population ranges, you're also looking at mix. And some of these assumptions that are being built into this program, I don't know if they're policy or recommendations, but they're game changers on all of the decisions you're making. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Darcy.
Keith Howard, 4680 North King Mountain Road. I'd just like to explain a little bit more about Mr. O'Brien's question to the county or the city about annexation process. I've got property in that northern annexation area by the Kelly Road next to the guide, and we've been actively trying to get annexed for 10 years. And we've been told, and we're fortunate that the guide meridian, the improvements were put in on the guide. There's a new sewer line in the guide, a new water line in the guide. Due to an agreement with Deer Creek Water, we have water available, but we don't have sewer because that sewer line is not activated. And we've been told by Public Works that they won't support us getting annexed unless we pay for the improvements. In fact, they told us they didn't have money to be able to tell us what it would cost, so we had to finance a study to figure out what was needed for a pump station, how much it would cost, and it was between $700,000 and $1 million. And there's no large property owners in that area, and so we have no way of doing, and they won't provide a public LID. We got to do a private LID, and no one's capable of financing that. And in the process of trying to drum up some money to do this study, I talked to a lot of people on the west side of the guide, from Horton Road up to Klein Road. And they've been in the city for over 20 years, and they don't have services. One of them, the guy that had the feed store there, he had an opportunity to sell his property, but they had to have sewer. And he couldn't get it. And so I think I'm a little confused why everybody keeps talking about how much it's going to cost to annex this property into the city, because for us, it's not going to cost the city anything, because they're saying we got to pay for all of it. And I assume that Kitech is going to have to pay to annex some of that property in as well. And they're going to have to put in the pump station. I don't know, probably do a private LID, which would be a good thing. But a lot of your numbers show how much is that annexation area is going to bring in, or how much property is available for development, and the stuff on the west side of the guide is available. And I don't think either one of those are going to happen unless someone with a large enough project can finance the LID to bring all of that in.
About 30 seconds, Keith.
And so I just think it's a good thing, and it supports, it makes your numbers right. Otherwise, your numbers are not right, because we've been working hard for 10 years, and we're no closer than we were 5 years ago.
Thank you.
Eric Scott from Birchwood neighborhood. I wanted to just make some comments on Commissioner Brown's push for more affordable housing, and I have that in quotes, affordable housing. My understanding, that's multifamily housing, not the single family. And I would say that's low-income row housing. It's a boon to developers. You get to pack more people in per area. People do not want to live there, and this is not just retirees we're talking about wanting to live in normal single-family homes. These are families. Certainly developers would not want to live in the kind of housing being proposed under Mr. Brown's affordable housing. When you build housing people do not want to live in, you build a city people do not want to live in. If the economy cannot support normal housing, then that's the problem. You don't build for a lower and lower common denominator. Then you get the squalor of India eventually, and I've talked to people that have been there. So just a kind of a qualitative comment on that. Keep reminding that that kind of housing, as we're building more and more percentage of that type of housing, you're building more and more of what people don't want to live in long term. I live in a very modest 3-bedroom, 2-bath house. Certainly could retire there. Wouldn't want to raise my family in anything less than that. Fiance wouldn't want to live there anywhere less than that. So just want to bring that up, that we shouldn't build housing people don't want to live in long term. You build a city people don't want to live in. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric.
I'm Bob Carmichael, 1700 D Street, Bellingham. I represent Kitech USA Corporation as well as an attorney. I want to just start off by reminding everyone that one of the tasks of the city with the Comprehensive Plan update is to further the goals of the Growth Management Act. And one of the primary goals listed is housing. It's one that has to be dealt with. You're dealing with it, you're grappling with it, which you need to do, but I just want to read what that goal says in the law. It says, housing, encourage the availability of affordable housing to all economic segments of the population of this state, promote a variety of residential densities and housing types. So if there's an obligation, and I think there clearly is under GMA, to plan for a variety of housing types, that would include single-family housing. It would include affordable single-family housing. And I'm just pointing that out to remind everyone that I think, as Mr. Jones mentioned, the market has shown better than any forecasting or data we can do now what is workable, affordable single-family housing in our community. The market has shown that. Those houses that Mr. Jones mentioned are up in the northern end of the city, the far north end of the city. And Kitech is sold out. They basically sold out their houses in that development. There may be a couple left, but it's basically sold out. They're next moving to an approved plat that's 72 acres, which is right on the northern limits of the city. And they've got a final plat approval for one of the phases of those already, and they're going to keep going. And if things keep going as they are, and the market shows that there's this demand for what we believe is affordable single-family housing at the price point Mr. Jones mentioned, that's going to sell out too before the 20 years are up. So then what do? We believe it's the obligation of the city to plan for that eventuality. We understand that there are costs associated. Those are not costs that, it's not anybody's fault that there's these deficiencies. It's not the Planning Commission's fault or the staff's fault or our fault. They're realities. I think Mr. Ticey made the best point. Are those costs going to go up or down in the next 10 years? By deferring those costs, are we doing a benefit to our community by not planning, or are we better off to try to resolve some of these issues now?
About 30 seconds.
I'm sorry, what?
About 30 seconds.
30 seconds, thank you. I'd like to end by pointing out that we've taken the cost issue very seriously when we've been looking at this. We've been working with a professor at Western Washington University, Hart Hodges, who's the director of the Center of Economic Development and Business Research there. His preliminary analysis is that on the cost issue for the Kitech property, it's favorable, that there is not this huge liability. We're going to have to compare our numbers with the city numbers. Mr. Hodges has been working with the economic model that the city uses, and so we're going to try to figure out what the differences are in the next couple of weeks. But I'll pass out this letter that he's written preliminarily to you that does indicate that the cost breakout is favorable. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob.
Wendy Harris. First, I would really like to acknowledge what I think is a really wonderful change in policy, and that is, for the first time in a long time, we're being given alternatives that actually list the pros and cons. And I really appreciate that, and I want to thank the Planning Department because, you know, recently we've been getting pre-decided plans and told all the great things about it, and we know life doesn't work that way. There's always trademarks. So thank you for being honest and open and allowing us to join in making intelligent decisions for our community. Having said that, I would like to talk again about why we need an EIS with regards to these UGAs. It's just saying that our plans haven't changed too much isn't adequate, because you also have to look at the environmental side. And in the last 10 years, our environment has changed quite a bit, and that's what we need to look at. In the last 10 years, we're now dealing with a climate crisis that wasn't a crisis 10 years ago. The lakes become more degraded. We now have Asian clam infestation and other aquatic invasive species. We're dealing with oil trains and coal trains in an area that's planned for an urban village. No one has even considered the fact we're putting density in a half-mile blast zone. That's something that would have been addressed if we had an EIS. And we have a lot of traffic now with more people. That traffic has impacts on health and safety. These are all things that are not being addressed. The sea star die-off, not addressed. Seabird die-off, not addressed. And I'll tell you why this matters. If you want to get more people and a higher population in Bellingham, what we really need to be talking about instead of the land capacity analysis is the carrying capacity, which is how much land, how many people the land can sustain and still be healthy. And that's a moving target because it depends on how lightly you touch the earth and how healthy your ecosystems are. And the more we can do to keep our critical areas and ecosystems resilient, the more impact that it can absorb and the more growth that we can absorb and still have a healthy environment and keep ourselves healthy. And I'd also like to address this concept of low income or affordable housing. I don't understand how, when we're at a situation when we're out of land, if we continue to develop on that scarce land so it becomes even scarcer, that's going to make housing affordable. That's not how I understand economics. And I mean, I studied economics in college, and I don't think I would have gotten a very good grade, you know, if that was the solution I came up with.
30 seconds, Wendy.
We've got to really take a realistic look at what we're doing. I'd suggest we look at cities like San Francisco, 49 miles of peninsula. It can't grow out, and it's very protective of its character, its neighborhood character. What kinds of things are they doing to deal with growth and affordable housing? Because I don't think that what we're doing, continually expanding, is really a good solution. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, Paul Schisler, 13 Prospect Street. I'm a planner, and I focus on community development planning, and I am particularly interested in housing and housing affordability. So I really appreciate the way the audience and the staff and the planning commissioners have focused on that aspect of this issue of how fast we grow and where. But there's another dimension to that, and that's what can people afford. And where would they prefer to live? Now, a realtor or a developer of small single-family homes that are priced at relatively affordable prices proves that there is a market for that for people who have enough money to buy a home like that. 100% of the median income for a family of four is around $64,000, but 100% of the median income for a single-person household is $45,000. Now, over half the population has incomes below the median, and many, you know the numbers, over 40% of the population has incomes below 80, and we could slice the demographics. So you would see how many households in Bellingham now already have incomes at 30% of the median and below. Good rule of thumb, if your income is $20,000, divide by 40, that's what you can afford per month for housing, including basic utilities. So if you earn $30,000 a year, you can afford $600. Is that right? You do the math, divide by 40 to get the monthly housing cost. But I know it's 20 divided by 40 is $500. And so many people don't even have $500 that they have to spend more than that, but $500 would be affordable. So we do need single-family homes. I have no doubt that the city will plan for more single-family homes. But I wanted to link that to the issue of subsidy for housing. Greenfield development, especially 840 acres, 360 acres and 840 homes. It's less than 3 homes per acre. Any planner and number cruncher, public works director too, could tell you that residential development, Rick mentioned this already this evening, residential development at a low density doesn't generate the kind of revenue that it takes to provide the services for that number of homes per acre. So the question is, how many homes per acre till you break even with the tax base? Is it 12? Is it 15? I asked a consultant that worked for the city property counselors, and he said it's probably closer to 25 to 30 homes per acre until you have enough economic activity just to pay for the cost of community services, not counting the initial infrastructure paid by impact fees and by the community at large covering the deficiencies. So I think you ought to be talking about minimum densities if you have expanded UGAs. Really, you can't afford the community cannot afford low-density housing. Let me put it another way.
About 30 seconds.
If the city can afford to do that kind of subsidy of lower density housing, then let's measure that and do at least the equal amount of subsidy for higher density housing that lower income people can afford. Okay? So if we're going to subsidize people who can buy single family, let's subsidize people who can't buy single family and can't barely afford the rent. And then there's a third piece to this, and I'm not sure, there's a fatal flaw in here, I betcha. But there's a third piece to this, and that is, how do we pay for that subsidy? Well, you're going to figure out how you're going to pay for it for the UGA. Let's figure out how we do it for the rest of the housing that this community needs. If you need 17,000 more dwellings over the next 20 years, and at least half of those need to be affordable at median income, and a lot of them affordable well below median income, that's over 400 homes per year that need to be in the affordable for low income range. We're nowhere near 400 homes per year now. We need to figure out where the subsidy comes from. And I think it comes from the wealth that the community creates when you push the land value from wherever it is now to whatever it will become when you upzone. Or all of us made this such a nice community that it's very desirable, and the price of land and the price of existing homes have gone up. State law doesn't allow us to do a real estate excise tax large enough to fund all of the subsidy we need, but that windfall created by the community but captured by the seller, it might be one place we could find it. Another place to find it is...
Paul, you need to wrap it up.
All right. The last comment would be, when we increase the value of land, we increase the wealth of the community, and there ought to be a way to try to capture at least half of that.
Thank you.
Thanks for letting me go over.
Hello, my name's Clayton Petrie. I live in the Birchwood neighborhood, and I wanted to address Mr. Brown's question. If you look at RCW 367070, you'll see that there's language in there that says, identify sufficient land for housing, including but not limited to government-assisted housing, housing for low-income families, manufactured housing, multifamily housing, and group homes, and foster care facilities, and makes adequate provisions for existing and projected needs of all economic segments of the community. You know, our consolidated plan tells us that we're 4,000 to 5,000 affordable units short now. And, you know, all this stuff that's coming up adds on top of that. We haven't addressed that adequately, in my opinion, and it sounds like you sort of are leaning the same way. I would like to point out that the cumulative EIS analysis over the years has always favored having the U Street area in the city of Bellingham, annexed into the city of Bellingham and developed. That's why it was in the UGA. In fact, the city proposal this last time around in 2009, they asked to keep that area in and reluctantly let it be put in reserve. And they said that, you know, they can serve it. They want to come up with a better plan on how to serve it. But they think they can. I think it's a big problem if we want to try and depend on a sold-out developer that is only building 3 units a month. That's not very. I mean, it's great that they're doing that, but that's not enough. I'd like to echo all of Wendy's comments. I thought those were great. And you know, the other thing you're counting on is thousands and thousands of condos in the blast zone. And I think that's a big problem. Adding only 1% to your single-family home capacity does almost nothing. So the last thing I wanted to do is briefly go over this testimony that I sent you about the impacts of growth. And you'll see the city produced spreadsheets that talk about how these different annexations produced $262,000 profit, $16 million profit at build-out, and $2 million profit at build-out. And, you know, one of the things that's missing out of those that I believe is included in this new analysis that I haven't seen, I assume you guys don't have the spreadsheets either, but there's these, Mr. Sepler mentioned these deficiencies, these current deficiencies. The South Bellingham has a huge problem with delivering fire service in a big portion of the city.
About 30 seconds.
And, you know, you really have to look at how adding an area that already has a ton of urban facilities contributes to your current deficiencies and in a positive way. You know, you have more people helping to build, like, for example, this fire station that the city already needs in that area, helping to put in a regional water tank that helps pressurize our entire water system in that area. It's really important stuff. I don't think that's in the analysis. You know, there's also environmental things like, you know, busing kids into a school that is supposed to be walkable. There's all kinds of environmental impacts. If you look in the EIS at the biodiversity mapping, you'll see that U Street has low and mid biodiversity value, whereas the areas in the north have high and mid and low. They have a mix, but they go all the way to the high area. You might look at taking the parts of the Dewey Valley area out that have high biodiversity value and have people that do not want to be in or develop the UGA. I have a lot more to say, but I guess I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thanks, Clayton. You'll have more opportunity, I'm sure.
My name is Larry Horowitz. I think we're losing sight of why we're here. So much topic about housing and where the developers have land and so forth. But one of the things we're really here to do is determine what our growth forecast should be. And it's really a function of what OFM information has sent to you. And I haven't heard a single person talk about what the OFM data was. These are the notes from a PC meeting that you guys selected high. And I highlighted what, Allie, you said. You said that we should pick the high because it's between the 1600 and the 1400. Well, that was then, and that's when you had old data. That was data through 2010. This is what Greg handed out last week. So the 1600 and 1400 has fallen to 1300 and 1150. I haven't heard a single person say anything about that. Your whole basis for choosing high is no longer valid. I have asked the planning department to verify the data. This is all taken from OFM. This is not my data. I'm hoping they'll respond to me at some point. If you look at those two top squares and triangles that show Burke, that is way outside the averages you've ever experienced. That's just totally invalid data. You can see that high is above any average we've ever experienced. So those blue dots are the averages from 1968 through 2014, 1969 to 2014, et cetera. We, right now, for the last 10 years, have been averaging well below the low forecast that you were given an option to choose. These numbers are highly autocorrelated, meaning that you could predict, there's a 3-year lag correlation, you can predict that where you're going to be for the next 3 years is comparable to where you've been in the last couple. So it's more than likely you're going to stay below the low through probably halfway through the next 7-year period when you're going to look at this again. So by the time you look at this again in 2020, you'll still be under that low. I haven't heard a single person talk about the population growth forecast that you should be getting. This is the OFM data that you're supposed to be looking at. Who's looking at this? It's not just about housing and who has land that they want to build houses on. The other thing is the GMA requires that the comprehensive plan recognize the informed consent of the community. Who has talked about the informed consent of the community? You have ignored the informed consent of the community. Every one of the people that come here has had comments that have been ignored. I'm not telling you how to do your job, but really, this is your job.
Thank you.
Perry Eskridge from the Whatcom County Association of Realtors. I was kind of wondering when in this process we were finally going to get the bad news, and I am convinced that it's tonight. I wanted to drill down to, I think, what are the 3 most salient points the decision that are confronting you. First of all, neighborhoods don't want development, so we must accommodate that. There is no political will with regard to putting infill into other areas of the city. You're going to have to accommodate that. And finally, the existing deficiencies in the city services and infrastructure make further development much too expensive. So you're going to have to accommodate that. What hasn't been discussed is that, you know, we're talking about housing. Paul Schisler, who knows affordable housing probably better than anybody I know, is telling you 400 houses a year. That ought to scare the crap out of you. Where are you going to put all that? That's just to meet your affordable, well, I'm going to say, you know, affordable, let's call it what it is. That's your low-income housing goals. What about all the other housing? Where's that going to go? I was on a conference call today. I'm going to talk out of school. I'll probably get in trouble with the State Realtors Association. It was a legal affairs panel call, and we were talking about the Spokane City Bill of Rights. One of the big things there is that neighborhoods have rights, the environment has rights, it has to have the ability to sue as an individual to make sure that people are treating the environment correctly. And one of the things that stuck out was when one of my colleagues tell me that they think it's ironic that somebody from Bellingham is telling Spokane how to grow. You know, we're looking at all of this, the realtors are looking at all of this, and it's not going to work. I mean, it really ought to concern you. I said this last time. When Wendy Harris and I are on the same page that this is screwed up, you got a problem, okay? Right, Wendy? I don't know where to go with this. You know, I was talking to Greg about this today. The realtors want to sit down and talk about where the people are coming from, when they're looking to buy, and what they're looking to buy. And if you just go through my membership, and I told them, you know, we're trying to get it from the anecdotal piece to the reality piece. Nobody's looking for condos, okay? Go take a look at the FHA financing rules and then just draw that line along the major streets and the railroads and see how many urban villages you intersect when you talk about building them. I'm really concerned, and I want to echo Mr. Carmichael's comments too, that you better start addressing the housing, you better start addressing the housing types. Those housing types that he listed are the mandatory housing types. Those have to be addressed. The rest of it is, you know, sort of up to your discretion. So, good luck.
Thank you, Perry.
Hello, I'm Christopher Granis, Chuckanut Drive. Thanks for providing this forum that people can speak. And I have a perspective that I haven't heard very many other people talk about, and that is, I think we should look at what we want Bellingham to be in the future. At some point in the future, Bellingham will have to be sustainable because growth in a finite environment is not sustainable. And I would urge everybody to think about what kind of a city they'd like Bellingham to be at that point, and then look backwards and plan for that time. It's also important to get a projection of when should it be sustainable. Should it be in 20 years? Last week, the planning director gave a presentation that basically said Bellingham would be full if we use the medium projection, population increase. Do we want to stop growing in 20 years? Or should we take a lower projection so that the growth can continue further on? The other thing I'd like to say is that I became a neighborhood activist out of a desire to save or protect environment. I'm very much concerned with the deterioration of the Puget Sound, which is caused largely by growth. And expanding the UGAs is worse for the environment than building up in the urban core. So just based on that, I think restricting the UGAs is a good thing, particularly when the environment is more susceptible to damage. For instance, Lake Padden is under stress environmentally, and incorporating the U Street UGA, or bringing it back into the UGA, would put that much more stress upon Lake Padden. I second Wendy's request for environmental impact statements. I think that's really important for protecting the environment. We have to know what we need to do to protect the environment, but I hear very little about that. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to come down and make a comment? Come on down.
My name is Mike Roster, and I live in Sunnyland. Thanks again for the opportunity here. I would just like to say that I'd like to echo the comments of Wendy and Christopher, and also mention the fact that above and beyond even our requirements for this process, the state and federal government require us to provide potable water to the citizens for the foreseeable future, as long as we have a city. I have some real concerns that in the time I've been here, I've seen that water quality get steadily worse. And I do believe we have a responsibility to try to keep the costs of our water and sewer supplies within reason, so that our taxes don't go up to some stratospheric heights. I also don't like the idea of only the wealthy being able to afford some sort of clean water by either buying it or straining it or whatever, and so that the poor people end up having to eventually, and this could be very soon, probably within 20 years, drink what they can afford, which is essentially the trickle down that we get from the lake. So I'd just like to reiterate that this is not about supporting developers or supporting the idea of people making profits. This process is about keeping the quality of the town that we live in at some sustainable level that we love, and so that our grandchildren that may grow up here or the people that are here now get to experience the type of city that they had hoped to live in. It's not up to us. We don't have the obligation to provide for imaginary people that may or may not arrive. We can pick the lower projections, and we can also work to those lower projections to try to keep our growth steady and slow and not cancerous. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else like to make a comment? Okay, I think that's it for tonight in terms of comment. Thank you all very much for your comments. Encourage you to come to all of our meetings, and we'll try and provide opportunity to hear from you at each one. And with that, we'll close the public comment portion of our work session. We're going to talk about this some more, so encourage you to stay around and listen in. And I think that the planning staff would like an opportunity to respond to some of the comments. Is that right, Rick?
Just, if I could, in general, a couple of comments that might help. The first is we agree in terms of testimony that was received about U Street being characterized by urban growth, hence the desire to retain it in the urban growth area. The challenge is to try to manage the costs that come associated with that, and we're interested certainly in any new information about those costs. We'll review it closely. The second, in terms of development paying for itself, we've talked earlier about development pays for its frontage, its direct improvements, the roads it needs, impact fees to buy into prior systems, but it's those downstream issues they contribute to where we are already deficient. And you're right, testimony is on point. We do need to face those. The question is to have a managed plan to do it, and not come to a circumstance where it's we aren't ready to address it. In terms of the visioning for the community, I think it's important to note is we're not revising the entire comprehensive plan. The comprehensive plan is still a valid document. although there have been some changes that have been asserted by a number of folks and certainly accepted by this body and by the planning department, our review indicates fundamentally it's a sound document, and that document does stress diversity of concerns that we continue to this day to implement and focus in environmental protection, in housing, in utilities and services. So I guess the sense is this is not a chance to reinvent the wheel. It's a chance to true that wheel, to make sure that it's staying on track. Thank you.
Thank you. So, commissioners, any follow-up questions for staff or thoughts, comments at this point? Motions? Steve?
Yeah, would it be possible, staff, to send us that land capacity analysis slide tomorrow or something? I'd like to see that. Also like to see the slide that Mr. Horowitz produced on that population over time. That slide, if you could get that to us, I'd like to see that.
I think they got that. I think you've already gotten that, but we can make it available to you. It's probably in your stack.
Probably in here.
He's asked us to confirm it. We received materials on Tuesday. We've been a little hard pressed to get ready, but we will address his request. And if we can get that, we'll provide that to you in time and manner too.
Email it, send it out. I'd like to have that in hand to look at it. There was a comment by Mr. Howard about utilities along the guide. The proposed Kitech new UGA area, why doesn't that include the guide meridian, say from Horton North, and include that area to get utilities in there, because there's obviously no development going on along that corridor, because it's up to the buyers or developers to do that themselves. I don't understand why that wouldn't be included.
No, I would just, Ted can add, I would say that if the decision is to add the Kitech property, we would recommend that include the property along Meridian Street as well, because there's a gap between the Kitech property and Meridian Street. We would want that all included.
Yeah, there'd be some services that could support that development, definitely, along that corridor.
Yeah, that's accurate. Ted Carlson, Public Works Department, those two really would go hand in hand. The sewer improvements needed to serve the Meridian Klein proposed annexation area could be in some ways accommodated in conjunction with sewer service, utility service needed to serve the Kitech area. So we would recommend that they would be combined and that area be brought in together.
Okay, thank you.
Ted, while you're up there, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
On Samish Hill, we've got a bunch of property that is in the city limits that's not developed, and there were some comments from the public that kind of made it seem like the infrastructure that would go in for the U Street annexation area might have broader benefits or might contribute to infrastructure that we need to develop portions within our city limits. Is that true, or can you kind of talk about that a little bit, how the whole undeveloped portion in the city and that portion interface?
Yeah, and I think that particular point holds true with both of the potential annexation areas, both the U Street area and the Kitech area to the north, in that there's improvements that will be required to serve the development proper itself, but at the same time there's benefit to the broader area. An example may be increased fire flow, redundancy, things of that nature. I think Cal brought up the fire flow issues, for instance, at Wade King Elementary School. I mean, that's being accommodated now through an on-site tank. He spoke about the possibility of building a larger reservoir up on top of U Street. Well, that would not only just serve development there, but it helps us address some of our other pressure zone issues and it does help deal with some existing deficiencies. And so when you look at the numbers that that we talk about in aggregate, and we probably need to dive into those in more detail at some point, but those are not just capital improvements, they're also operational costs. But when you look at the capital improvements for utilities, it's always a blend of private and public dollars that are going to fund those improvements. And again, that holds true for both to the north and to the south.
Thank you. Phyllis?
Yes, as I was listening to all of these things, I think it's very difficult to weigh everything and come out with everybody feeling like they got the winner. But over the course of several weeks here, we've been listening to people talk about no infill in my backyard, and they want to maintain their community character. And one of the things that I see about both the potential development to the north in the Kitech and also in the U Street area is it's new development. You're not coming in, unless I'm mistaken, and I would love to be corrected if I am, this is coming in without the same issues going on with the neighborhood. You're coming in and doing a full project. Am I correct in that?
Yes, the areas to the north would not, the existing community is relatively recent. This would be a logical extension of those that are already developed.
What about South U Street as well?
Again, I can't say with certainty on that. There is pre-existing development. Often folks who are pre-existing have concerns. Nonetheless, there's been long-standing desire by the area to join the city.
I guess my question then becomes, if we want to stay away from infill and not harm the community character that's already here, why are we not looking at bringing both of those areas into the UG? I know that the money, the cost issue, which I think is something else that we can be addressing and with some discussion, but it seems that there are fewer concerns, again, I might be mistaken on this, with the development that would go in those two areas than with just about any place else we've been seeing in the city. If people are coming out about many of their neighborhoods and they want to maintain their character, we would be developing the character of that particular area is what I'm saying. I mean, I'm leaning toward the idea of other than the cost, which I think is something else that we can talk about, why not bring both of those in? Yeah, I'm asking the question, actually.
I guess the sense would be is that if cost were not an issue for U Street, we would be recommending its inclusion, since it is characterized by urban services, as noted by testimony. There's a school, there's our water lines and our facilities. It's the cost that discouraged prior annexation attempt before, and for the northerly portion. And I think that's the rub here. If the direction is bring those areas into the city, we really need to assess a better way of financing and funding that over time and talk about what the implications are. Unfortunately, as noted by Mr. Schischler, if we put our dollars to make this happen, there's limited dollars. He asked rhetorically, can we balance that in other areas? And the answer is there's just not enough money to do that. That's our challenge.
So would there be a large shortfall from what the developer would be doing in that particular development, the South U Street?
Yes. And we are, as asserted tonight, there's new information that would have less of an impact over time. We're happy to review it. We're also happy to share. What we're hoping this evening is you give us direction on what alternative you'd like to bring forward so we could do that detailed analysis and bring you much more than just a single line. And you can see where the costs are and the times when they come forward.
Thank you.
Can I ask a quick question to Chris about that? The cost, and maybe this isn't for you, but the cost that we're looking at, this big number, is based on a comparable zoning, we're guessing kind of, because with like U Street, for example, it's in the reserve, so it doesn't have it has like a rural 10-acre zone designation or something.
So for the South U Street area, the numbers that were put into the city's financial model to come up with the dwelling unit totals that we used were the zoning that was being considered in the 2006 comp plan before the 2009 county ordinance that removed it from the growth area. So it was a mix of a little bit of 6 unit per acre and then some 6 to 10 and 6 to 12 unit per acre URMX zoning.
Okay. Do we have the option, I know we talked about this before, but to increase zoning density in our or in our UGA areas when we bring them in, and how would that impact our financial modeling if we added more people and thus more revenue?
We do. Once the property's in the city, of course, we control the zoning.
We can change it then.
It would perhaps change the revenue picture. It doesn't change the capital and maintenance costs of rebuilding U Street to an urban standard, for example.
Sure. Steve?
Comments from Mr. Horowitz on the population numbers, the actual and the forecasted numbers. Are you using those actual numbers per his chart, or are you what kind of forecast base are you using to project medium, high, and low population growth?
Maybe we need to have a longer conversation about this. The low, medium, and high numbers came from the consultants. Those are not staff's numbers. Those were the experts that we hired that developed those numbers. And what they did was they took the county-wide number, the OFM medium forecast for the entire county, and they apportioned those growth estimates based on historic trends. So for Bellingham, it was low, medium, and high based on historic trends. I don't know how to explain it any more than that, except maybe if we spend some time going through the details.
Do you think those assumptions are valid?
Yeah,
I do, absolutely, yes.
I think the challenge we have is we agreed with the county to help develop those numbers rather than just taking the pure OFM numbers. And we agreed to use the range that was provided. So the choices provided us to the county are those low, medium, and high. That's what we get to work with. We would have to, if we wish to change that with the county, there's significant issues associated.
Perhaps, yes. I mean, the low, medium, and high range is a fairly significant range. If we were to go outside of that, I mean, I think that's a whole nother conversation to have. But the low, medium, and high is a fairly significant range, and it does reflect some historic trends, especially the medium number, which is based almost entirely on historic trends, not the last 10 years or even the last 20 years, but further than that.
Thank you.
Garrett?
Yeah, I guess the big issue that I struggle with is looking at the assumptions that we're making about the types of housing forms, and what we're doing is projecting a pretty large paradigm shift in the way that people want to live from our historical precedent that's been set by mainly people wanting single-family housing in this community. We're projecting quite a bit of multifamily infill density to assume that population. I recognize that we are constrained physically in our barriers, and that change in housing is going to happen. I wonder if we're pushing it a little too quickly. I like, urban villages, and I think, sustainable planning and smart growth and densification of cities is key to our, sustainable growth. I think there's time for it, and I think there's room for both. I do have some apprehension about the lack of expansion of a UGA, especially in areas that are already characterized by urban development, specifically, the U Street and even to the north. Though that doesn't mean those are to be annexed. It means that they need to be evaluated and looked at and studied from a financial perspective. Maybe the zoning needs to be reflective of the cost. Maybe the paradigm of what our subdivisions look like needs to change. Maybe it shouldn't be 6 units per acre. Maybe it should be 20. If that's what it takes to accommodate the deficiencies that we have, I would support option D, which would be to include both those areas into the UGA, not in the reserve, and get some detailed analysis on what that looks like to our community for the future.
I would echo that, actually.
Question. I have a question. I thought Clayton brought up a good point, suggesting that there's already existing deficiencies in city services, for example, in the South End, and I think, Ted, this is kind of what we were just talking about, that development of an area like the U Street area might contribute to a lessening of the deficiency within our existing city limits, I think that's the idea he was trying to convey. And I'm wondering if that's true, and if so, have we looked at that financial implication? Because if we've already got a deficiency in our existing city limits that we're going to be paying for, and we've got a deficiency we're projecting for the annexation area, the UGA area, and we're looking at those separately, that's not really fair in my mind, because if some of those costs are shared, I guess, right? If we bring in the UGA area, it's going to help subsidize costs that we already are planning on incurring through our capital facilities planning for deficient areas. And I'm wondering if that's an accurate assessment that Clayton's made, and I'm wondering if those numbers are on our financial numbers, because it doesn't sound like they are. It sounds like we're looking at this in a vacuum.
To be fair, if I might respond, I do believe we do consider it. The challenge we have is the significant change in cost from a rural standard, this county standards, to our standard. From a rural fire district that serves that area, the minute it becomes part of the city, it has a 4-minute response time. That's a fire station. That's about $5 million plus 12 firefighters. And that's the fact of it. Because we have exposure as a city with an existing deficiency if we can't meet our level of service. That's the big jump up that we can't sort of gradually get into, and that's the stuff we have to overcome. And we can provide you the detailed data. If it's the inclination of the commission to pursue both areas, we'll break down the cost over time, have detailed analysis, and show you, go in eyes wide open.
There's no perfect way to assess these things,
no.
Unfortunately. You're correct. I mean, some improvements in South U Street would help that Samish Hill area. There's no doubt about that. But, you know, there is the issue of the fire station and the firefighters that go along with it. And there's no way that the development at 20 units per acre could pay for the ongoing costs of a fire station and 12 firefighters, or the $20 million it's going to take to upgrade the south end of U Street to an urban standard. Because once people get out there and live there, you know they're going to want sidewalks and street lights and the full range of urban services, and that's what they should have if they're in the city. But there's no perfect way to assess these costs or to project them. We do the best we can with the information that we have available and their projections, and you know, I just hope that people understand that this is not a perfect science.
I respect that comment, and I wonder, one of the things you talked about was level of service review, and as a part of our thinking, and so that, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the concept of saying maybe that level of response time or that level of service, whether it's parks acreage or fire response time, maybe changes. Is that what level of service review would be?
I think it's, we anticipate coming as part of our comprehensive plan, taking a look at the cumulative expense over time of the level of service we have established and evaluating different alternatives and implications of it. We have a very high level of service. We have a very high quality of life. In some areas we have less discretion, as you'll hear, with trying to reduce response time. And they'll give you the mortality figures of extending time. How many more folks won't survive because we can't get to them fast enough. There probably is more flexibility in parks or other areas, but again, we can't segregate a portion of the city and say, because you're last in, you have a special lower level of service. We'd have to be more broad in terms of the city itself. And that's the rub. So we will be working through that as part of the capital facilities element. We will be looking at that with rigor. It may help in some of the affordability, it may lessen that bump. We might have better strategies in terms of phasing things in. If that's the direction to proceed in, to add something, we look at the best way to ramp up to it, to defer the cost or to allocate it over time to achieve it. And I think Ted could speak more to that. That seems to be the approach we'd use.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And as Rick said, in some areas you can be more flexible than others with utilities, for instance. I mean, we have requirements for fire flow and, you know, minimum flow and pressure, and the same thing on the wastewater side. But on the transportation side, in the public works arena, we do have some flexibility on level of service. But as Greg mentioned, you know, we're mindful of the fact of when areas come into the city that were built to urban standard, there's going to be a desire to put in curb, gutter, sidewalk, bike lane, and all of those urban services, which there should be because it's now in the city, and we're looking at those costs, and those are the ones that existing deficiencies can't be put entirely on development. They're absorbed into the overall transportation network and funded by everybody over time.
Thank you. Jeff?
Well, just to be clear, I would like to request that we get those particular spreadsheets that support the costs that were estimated for the two UGA areas. I don't know if we actually explicitly said that, but I'd like to see that information that you used to develop the estimate. But I would also like to see some metrics that give us some way to evaluate it. And, you know, maybe the metric is the subsidy from other taxpayers per single-family residence under existing zoning versus under a higher standard of zoning, say 10 or 12 units. I mean, just to get a feel for what we're really talking about here. I don't know whether you pull one of these areas in, we're talking about a $5,000 a household subsidy the other rest of the city is giving, or it's a $15,000, or it's a $30,000. I don't know what that actually means just looking at the number on the page, and I'd be very interested in that and how the interplay with density, like a minimum density, would play into that level of subsidy. And I don't know if that's something you guys are interested in, but that would give me an idea of the magnitude of what we're talking about here, because otherwise I look at, you know, it's like 40 or 50 million or 60 million, pretty soon you're talking about real money, I guess. So that would help me.
Well, we certainly can provide the information. I guess it's the time of the evening where staff asks for direction. Is it the Commission's pleasure to convene next week to look at those numbers? Is it the Commission's pleasure to give generalized direction on an alternative you'd like to see and take to public hearing? We'll certainly be responsive to your direction.
Does anyone have thoughts on that? Steve?
Yeah, I think we've heard from, what, 2-3 of us that would like to see alternative D explored per Phyllis's original recommendation. I think that's important right now. Break it down, as Jeff said, cost-wise, if we could break out one, break out two, and add the two together, and the total impact upon the community, if in fact those areas are brought in, an eventual tax burden upon the residents to add those services. I don't know what is more important for a city to do than to add services and take care of their residents. I think that's primary above everything else you do. So I hate to see it as a burden. I know it's costly, but I'd like to see those numbers very definitely. I don't know if you need a motion or just direction, if perhaps the chairman could reiterate and restate that as a request.
Let's see what some other commissioners have, and then maybe we can consolidate it into a single kind of direction to staff. Garrett, you had something to say?
No, I mean, I concur. I mean, I would be, you know, I would put to a motion that, you know, we direct staff to analyze, you know, alternative D, which would be the inclusion of both the U Street area and the area to the north into the UGA, and what that would look like for the growth forecast.
I would like just to add to that, instead of the large numbers, which Jeff is saying are starting to look big, what would it be per household or per thousand evaluation or something like that, so we can get it down to how much more of a check are we writing when we do our taxes each year? I mean, some guideline. I mean, just something that brings it down to the reality of the individual.
Garrett, was that a motion?
Yes. You could restate it if you like.
Maybe you should restate it for the benefit of the commissioner.
Move to direct staff to prepare alternative D, which would be expanding single-family opportunities into the UGA Reserve and U Street and north of the city. High-tech property.
Have a motion? Is there a second?
Second.
There's a second. So the motion was to direct staff to bring back, I'm assuming next week, an analysis of an option that included U Street as well as Kitech. Not as an exclusive. Well, that's it. So is there any discussion on that? Jeff?
Well, do you just want to tag on to come up with the analysis of cost right onto that? Because it's specific to that alternative, so that can just be one. What I said earlier can be added to that. We want to see those two things added, but also see what those costs are per household.
Okay.
And
I'm
densities.
wondering if we really even need a motion to accomplish this. I don't know if we can I ask for some Robert's
think
Rules
so.
assistance? It doesn't seem like we need a motion to ask you to come
Well,
back.
you can, if there's general consensus that you wish to see that materials, we certainly can prepare it. You
Okay.
don't need to act on a motion. Again, you're not adopting them, you're just asking for materials to be prepared for review. My understanding is you'd like to review them next week and
Yes.
use that session as a work session. What I can say is we feel fairly comfortable we can prepare those materials in time. We've got a good start on them. However, it is unlikely we'd have them available in advance of the meeting. So essentially, you'll come in, we'll walk you through them because of turnaround time.
That's reasonable.
I think that's reasonable, and I would just echo that it would help me as well to see the numbers because you're asking us to choose between effectively two areas that both cost relatively similar amounts when you look at like the average cost that you've projected, and without knowing why they cost what they cost, I don't feel like it's fair to make that call without more information, or choose neither, because I'd like to suggest that having more discussion on our end and looking at these additional alternatives and presented doesn't mean we're ruling out any of the three alternatives that have been presented tonight by staff, at least in my mind. I think we just need more time to think about the issues that have been raised.
We have clear guidance. We'll ask Brian Henshaw, our city's financial director, finance department director, to attend.
That would be
Ted will
great,
attend
yeah.
with his staff as appropriate. We'll attend to be able to break down the materials as best we can, and we'll present them to you and talk about the implications.
Okay, that'd be great. And I think our intent would be to try and get through it then at the next meeting, so we can follow the projected schedule
Yeah,
that,
so we'll have-
that
we'll
Greg,
have-
you let out. So, I mean, obviously we have our discretion as a group, but I'd like us to try and look toward making a recommendation next week if we can, as a body.
Right. And the recommendation next week is basically to recommend a alternative to go to a public hearing
Yes.
in June.
Pick a final option.
And also, if I have a clear understanding, you wish to, again, reinforce that next week will not be a public hearing.
Next week will
It's
not
just
be a
work-
public hearing, no. We will have a public hearing, and it sounds like you'll give quite a bit of notice for that, which will give everybody time to get a full packet well in advance, and then we'll take a little bit longer public comment at that meeting. So, okay. Well, I appreciate the presentation and feedback tonight, and I think with that for tonight, we'll wrap it up and call it close to this. And, you know, if everyone could hang tight for just 1 second, we have like very little work left, so we're going to continue on. So if you're going to leave, just please leave very quietly, or you could just sit for like 2 more minutes and then leave at the end, because we really don't have a lot of business left to attend to. And it'll help us so we don't have to deal with the racket of everybody getting up and chatting as they leave. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
I believe we've concluded tonight's business unless there's something that I
Is
don't
there
know
any
about.
new business?
No.
All right. With that, we will adjourn. Thank you for
It's like
waiting.
that.